Piet le Roux is one of those NGOs that was spoken about earlier. There's very powerful, strong, non-governmental organization, civic society body that kept South Africa alive during the darkest days. And sheesh, they were dark. One day I'll do my little story on just the bit that I saw. And I can tell you it was very dark. We spent 3 years in the UK. And that's dark as well, in winter especially. But here it was dark. We had big London lawyers trying to put us out of business with lots of big pounds, all courtesy of the Guptas who stole the money from Eskom and wherever else they had the opportunity. And there's a little, I mean, we're not into Schadenfreude, never. But boy, when I saw some of those bombs or rockets going into Dubai, I thought, maybe there's a Gupta compound somewhere. Perhaps we can leak something to the Iranians. Who knows? God has a sense of humor, I promise you. You can read all about Piet. You can get the inside story of Piet. But the real story of Piet le Roux and Sakelige is that they have got guns the size of basketballs. They take on the government. There's no problem for them to say the things that the ambassador was telling us earlier he would love business in South Africa to say, to stand up and be counted. I know in the business community we have a similar situation where people are prepared to be counted. They're not telling the ambassador one thing and then behind the scenes or when they're going to public say something different. Piet, I'm sure he said it in Washington. He said it to the powers that be. But more than that, he said it to the powers that be in court and won 90% of the time. Piet le Roux.
This BizNews production is brought to you by Brenthurst Wealth, the leader in offshore investing, connecting South Africa to opportunities worldwide. Invest better with Brenthurst.
Alec, thank you for the invitation. About 3 years ago, I was invited to speak at the Black Business Council Gala dinner or gala event. And they had invited us as Sakelige to speak because we had just won a major court case, the first rollback of a BEE-type law in South Africa on public procurement. And it wasn't expected. And they invited me to give our reasons and our plans and share our thoughts on BEE forthrightly. And I did so. And I must say that they were very kind and hospitable in that. Alec, you have now invited me to be forthright once again. So let's see. Ladies and gentlemen, for 3 decades now, a fatal idea has spread throughout society and the business community in South Africa. But it has spread insidiously, posing as noble and ethical. So much so, in fact, that this idea has not only been warmly embraced and promoted by many in the business community, but even lauded and boasted about in well-intentioned boardrooms across the country. This idea is not just an idea, it is an ideology. An entire framework for organizing political and economic life. And as this ideology spreads throughout the state departments, businesses and social institutions of society, it begins to suffocate and destroy all in its path. This ideology is Transformationism, the guiding framework for state policy in South Africa. Emerging from the apartheid era, transformation was and still is relentlessly promoted as the unquestionable good for South Africa and its peoples, embraced by many wanting the best for the country and its communities. But intentions cannot forever trump hard realities. And the reality is that transformationism is indeed a fatal pursuit. Transformationism is the deep ideological commitment to remaking every part of society, including businesses, in the image of the state. Every business, school, club, church, association, and suburb, and the ownership of all assets and receipt of all income, according to this ideology, must eventually be in perfect proportion to the demographics of the entirety of South Africa. Transformation, ladies and gentlemen, is fundamentally totalitarian. Under this totalitarian framework, capital is devoured, evident in decayed infrastructure, from rail to ports to public utilities, to collapsed towns and even cities. Economic progress is throttled, evident in chronically stagnant GDP and relentlessly expanding joblessness. Productive people and financial capital are driven from these shores, evident in the 1 million or 2 million, mostly Westerners, that left the country, and also the JSE's structural contraction, with listings today at a historic low of just over 200 from its high of around 750. Discussing the transformationist program and its catastrophic effects today, fortunately, is much easier than it was even just 5 or 10 years ago. Until fairly recently, the ideology of transformationism was surrounded by a high-voltage electric fence of political correctness. But its harmful effects, its harmful results, have become too obvious to deny. Its architects too forthright in their extremism, and its targeting primarily of the Western subsection of the population too brazen for good people to remain silent and inactive. It is no longer so clear that these policies have noble motives. For nobility of motive would long ago have led to a change of course. The essential principle of transformationism is displacement. White people, and to a lesser but still significant degree other minority groups, are targeted for displacement. White shareholders are to be displaced from ownership, employees from jobs, children from schools and sports teams, farmers from land. The state is not too fussed about where the displaced go. If they leave the country, so be it. The constant waves of skilled emigration have never been seriously lamented by ANC-dominated governments. If they move to build new businesses, these businesses simply become new targets for further rounds of displacement. In the business world, transformation today is embodied chiefly by two policies. The first is Black Economic Empowerment, or BEE. I have to speak frankly, I could coach it in another language, but it is what it is. It is a program of race-restrictive ownership and company control, mixed with race-restrictive training, supply chain management, and charitable company spending. The second is employment equity, an extreme program for down to the decimal race-restrictive hiring that only the most hardened ideologues could conceive of. Together, these constitute a deliberate and systematic program of targeted domestic sanctions. Targeted because they are specifically aimed at white people and sometimes other minorities. Domestic because these measures are aimed at people inside the country who live here, call it home, contribute, employ, build, and invest here. And sanctions because they aim to punish, to dispossess, and displace by imposing extreme costs and restrictions upon those targeted. And these targeted attacks are intensifying. Today, even with the failures of transformationism so visible at every corner, its proponents are doubling down. The President of South Africa professes in Parliament late last year that BEE has no negative effect on economic growth. The Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition is launching a so-called transformation fund, redirecting billions from private sector businesses, and the whiter the businesses, the higher the required tributes must be. Not to speak of how his department has weaponized competition law to create a choke point for resource extraction. The Employment Equity Act's quota system is in its first year of implementation right now. And around every corner, public officials, politicians, and lobby groups are working to expand licensing requirements to more and more industries, and then tie those licenses to BEE compliance. Consider aviation, financial services, irrigation, agriculture, and other imports and exports, property practitioners. I could go on. The goal, ladies and gentlemen, is to make transformationism compulsory, a prerequisite for all economic activity. With focused litigation, Sakeliga has successfully contained, prevented, and delayed some of these, but we have not yet turned the tide. A South Africa that deliberately or implicitly harms and displaces some of its most productive communities cannot possibly hope to succeed. Indeed, transformationism is the very embodiment of an unsustainable South Africa, the kind of thing that the theme of this conference calls us to avoid, looking for a sustainable South Africa. If we do not stop, reverse, and ultimately break the hold of transformationist ideology, not only the Western groups and perhaps not only do the Western groups and perhaps other productive minorities in South Africa face an existential threat, but the entire country, and indeed the entire continent anchored by South Africa's economic sophistication, faces a structural and terrible economic collapse. State failure will compound and spread, creating vacuums of authority that invite further rounds of harmful predation by state and non-state actors. Productive people, white, black, colored, and Indian, will leave under such a scenario. Ironically, and rather tragically, it will be possible for some of us, even some of you here today, to make very good money in all this chaos. Decline, de-development, and even collapse present the sorts of opportunities that tough, intrepid entrepreneurs, of which we thankfully still have a good supply, know how to capitalize upon to make money on the way down. But to what ultimate good is this if we are left with a country our children and grandchildren no longer can or want to live in? If we have to leave the place we love? Clearly, transformationism is an existential threat, bearing both on individual businesses and owners, as well as the business environment. How do we counter it? One theory of change is voting. Every several years in national and local elections. Historically speaking, this theory of change, as now applied at the level of millions of people rather than a few thousand in a Greek polis, is a very recent phenomenon. The results are mixed. In some places the world over, mass democracy seems to be supporting the flourishing of communities and societies. But in others, whole countries have collapsed with very democratic, but also very corrupt, vindictive, and foolish governments. Among us today, there are those who will apply their best possible efforts within the framework of the voting-based theory of change. They should continue to do so, and where appropriate, they deserve our support. But clearly more is required. Consider the exasperation of the ANC member of the Executive Council for Northwest Province dealing with local government failure. Mr. Oageng Molapisi said last year that the national government should bring the team, bring the resources, bring everybody to restore order in Ditsobotla, a municipality around Lichtenburg in Northwest. He said, and this is remarkable, he said, voters would continue to give you the same outcome. So disbanding the municipal council is not an option. Intervention by the national executive is the last resort, he said in a 6 August statement. Essentially, the MEC realized that Lichtenberg was not voting their way out of this. Therefore, while those best suited to apply the theory of mass democracy for countering transformation as a theory of change should do their best. But we need an alternative tailored to those outside the state apparatus, in particular, businesses. And this alternative strategy is called state-proofing. State-proofing can be applied at 2 levels. The first is in the private sphere. The second is in the public or community sphere. Since individual circumstances differ, for state-proofing private concerns, I can only offer you general guidelines to be applied by you according to your own best judgment. Here are 2. Off-ramping. Securing private alternatives to supposed public utilities formerly provided by the state. Example, electricity, water, refuse, security, etc. Ladies and gentlemen, we have all been state-proofing already. But this is the first guiding principle, off-ramping. The second is manning up or man up. Maximum achievable non-cooperation with that which is harmful and unethical. And we say the maximum achievable because sometimes it is not achievable to directly confront or not comply with certain demands, however lawful or unlawful they are made of you, when the force behind them is sufficiently strong. Good people have sometimes suggested that business people are too quiet in the face of harmful public policy and state failure, and that they should speak up much louder. We had some speakers even saying that today. So to some, it might be a curious absence that I do not include this speaking out as part of my guidelines. The reason is that it is not inherently part of state-proofing. While it could be admirable for business people to individually take on politically sensitive topics in public, there are also practical and very real downsides that might endanger their businesses and everyone that relies on them, including your employees, shareholders, suppliers, your customers. So in most circumstances, directly exposing individual businesses to state ire is perhaps even the opposite of state-proofing, and should normally be undertaken only after careful consideration and as part of a larger and bigger plan. Such plans are possible. For example, during the 1980s, American businesses seeking to signal opposition to the National Party's apartheid policies publicly subscribed to an alternative set of ethical commitments. It was called the Sullivan Principles. There may well arise a time in the not-too-distant future when such collective speaking up can again identify ethically distinct businesses on a non-racial basis that publicly signal their opposition to the transformationist program. This is perhaps something to consider and explore. So much for the private part of state-proofing. But the second level of state-proofing is public, or more accurately, as pertaining to the shared or common domains. It is all good and well to state-proof yourself, but that doesn't scale. More importantly, state-proofing only private domains does not address that problem of harmful or failing public authority responsible for the failing business environment. As the American sociologist Robert Nisbet explained shortly after the Second World War in his book, The Quest for Community, balancing power in society requires more than brave individuals operating in isolation. It requires independent institutions and self-regulating associations that pool resources and accumulate the strength in numbers to provide real checks and balances on state power in the public interest and for the flourishing of society. Balancing power does not come only from within the state, the so-called trias politica, but rogue states and harmful state action can also be contained from strong, independent institutions from outside. That is part of a healthy constitutional order in the deepest sense. This type of organizing is every bit as necessary among business communities as it is in other areas of civil society. Without state-proofing our existing and new common good institutions, and where necessary, establishing them as dedicated and mission-driven vehicles, no degree of private state-proofing will prevent us from ultimately ending up with, at best, lots of money in a place we can no longer call home, and where the voices of our grandchildren and those that would have come long after them will never be heard. So I offer 3 guidelines for state-proofing our shared domains to address common threats arising from state failure, its targeted attacks, and the vacuums of order these produce. If you're an institution, follow a twofold strategy of checking harmful state action and its abuse of power where possible, for example, litigation and public pressure, while also setting up alternative structures for governance, order, and security wherever the vacuum left by state failure invites it. If you're a private concern, funding. Find dedicated mission-driven vehicles for public problems and fund them. And 3, build such independent institutions. Sakeliga is one of several institutions doing good and effective work, but the truth is, the state failure is exposing so many areas of life to chaos and disorder. Perhaps it is some of your task to build the new institutions that will be up to the task of restoring order and stability in these uncertain times in the context that applies to you and that you know and that you find yourself responsible for. Ladies and gentlemen, I conclude. State-proofing is the appropriate strategy for businesses willing to fulfill their deepest social obligation. Restoring economic order in service of flourishing communities and societies, regardless of the state. We will face opposition. We will face allegations that we are pursuing injustice. But we must forge ahead. For both the white communities so explicitly, unfortunately targeted under the current race restrictive program, and for the other communities in the region, not explicitly targeted, but who will be massively prejudiced by the spillover harms of targeting white businesses. There is no sustainable South Africa under transformationism. For business people today, the duty is the same as it would be in any other place and time in history when the dominant political structure fails to produce a favorable business environment or actively undermines it. It is our duty to state-proof our businesses and to state-proof the economic order which enables us to survive and thrive.
This BizNews production is brought to you by Brenthurst Wealth, a multi-award winning, truly independent boutique wealth manager. Invest better with Brenthurst.